Awesome. So we are now joined by the writer, producer, and lead actor of the movie Roe v. Wade, which comes out this Friday on iTunes, Amazon, and you can find it anywhere really streaming. It's Nick Loeb. How are you, sir?
Good. How are you?
Good. We're good. Just getting this week started, and excited to talk about this movie.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you guys for having me.
Yeah.
You guys out in Texas?
We are, yeah. So we're actually in Dallas. So this is something we grew up hearing about a little bit when we were growing up. So
yeah, definitely a topic.
Well, it's a Dallas story. So
yeah. So
well, I guess we just want to start off with, apart from how this movie is going to be received critically and by audiences, what's your opinion of how the film turned out? And does that kind of line up with what your vision was for the film and what you were hoping to do with it?
That's a great question. No, actually. So not at all. So the movie that I had written was even bigger in scope with a lot more characters. And I think the challenge we had was it was very complicated. Have you ever seen a movie called The Big Short?
Sure.
So it was more in that type of vein, and I think it was challenging. And even I've rewatched The Big Short a dozen times. Even The Big Short gets complicated. And even some things now, and I've been in banking and finance, I still don't understand through the end of it. And it was sort of done in that we went into depth and a lot more characters, and it just got too complicated, I think, for our audience, and they had a challenge following it because of all of the storylines, and it was a 2-hour and 20-minute movie that we cut half an hour out at the end of the day. And that happened obviously through testing and what our audience liked and what appealed more to our audience. So it wasn't what I originally planned or hoped for, but what we ended up with is amazing. I mean, I'll give you one example. There are a lot of cool things that were like left out of it. So I don't know if you remember, there's a scene in the movie where one of the guys essentially found Norma McCorvey and found the lawyers. And he's describing Norma. It's like, well, she was an alcoholic and she was a lesbian. And this guy was Norma McCorvey's lawyer, her adoption lawyer. And he was really integral part in the story of Roe v. Wade, because he was really the guy that put it all together. He's the guy who essentially went out and found the girl, and brought it to Planned Parenthood and NARAL, but really wasn't involved with them. He was the only guy sort of outside the sort of the circle of these guys. And interestingly enough, 6 months after the case, he was assassinated.
Jesus.
And you'll never guess who prosecuted the assassin.
I know that.
Henry Wade.
Guessing it's down, yeah.
Henry Wade.
Henry Wade. And so, this brought up a lot of questions, like, were they just trying to cut off loose ends? This was really the only guy outside who knew anything. It was sort of a, random guy who did. And so it sort of made it sort of very sort of Oliver Stone-esque for me. And these are some of the things that we had to cut out of the movie, because his people were like, wait, who is the guy they killed? He was only really in one scene. And, and so people were having a hard time following me with all of these things. And I mean, I think we were, to make it make sense, we probably would have had to, make it like JFK, a 3-hour movie. But nobody wants to sit through a 3-hour movie anymore. So
when you say that he was her adoption lawyer, was that like as she was going through the pregnancy?
So she had already had a child and put it up for adoption. Norma had 3 children.
Okay.
In her life.
So then why? I mean, I guess because in the movie it's made it to where she thinks she's going to have the abortion, sometime in those 9 months. Like she's going to do that. if she already had an abortion lawyer, then it kind of seems like she already
Well, it was an adoption lawyer, not an abortion lawyer.
adoption lawyer. That's what I meant. Sorry. So if she already had an adoption lawyer, it seems like she had already kind of resigned herself to getting an adoption.
Well, she hadn't. And so essentially, the adoption lawyer was from the previous pregnancy.
Okay.
And so when the adoption lawyer was involved with, knew the people at Planned Parenthood and knew Sarah Wennington and knew some of these folks and knew that they were looking for a girl, literally said, oh, I have a client who happens to be pregnant again, that he knew, he was in touch with, and he was also very involved himself in a lot of sort of social reform court cases. And so he called Norma and said, hey, Norma, I can get you an abortion. I know you don't want to give up a baby for adoption again, and I can get you an abortion, but you got to meet with these people and sign up with the case. So he sort of put it all together.
Okay. And I mean, that kind of goes into, this is a really kind of touchy subject of a movie, and it's something that I think definitely should be talked about. And with that character of Ro, she's central to everything, but she kind of, we're obviously from Texas, so we know how Texans are portrayed sometimes, but versus how they really are. It doesn't seem like that would have been really who she was. Like what kind of research did you do to, kind of
so Norma wasn't really involved in the case at all. So Norma, which is why there's only 2 or 3 scenes of her in the film. She literally, they went out, they found a girl, they talked to, they got her signed up at the pizzeria, never spoke to her again. Her dialogue in the pizzeria, how you find her, is literally verbatim. I mean, she wrote several books. There's a really dumb line in there. She said, well, what happens in an abortion? Does it go back like when John Wayne aborts a mission? I didn't make that up. Those are her words that she wrote in her book.
Yeah, I'm not saying you did. I'm just like, it's not even really about like word for word how she says it. It's kind of the portrayal of her as, this dumb, not very smart person who then
extremely young and extremely naive character who plays directly into the basic trap that is laid by the lawyers, right?
Yeah.
So you should watch some of the documentaries and read some of her books. She was extremely young. She was extremely naive. She had no idea. She was essentially beaten by her husband, a guy named Woody at the time. I mean, there were a bunch of scenes of Norma. Like, again, there were several scenes of Norma going more into her background that we ended up cutting because it was irrelevant to the storyline of the film. I mean, for example, we portrayed her as young, dumb, and naive. So essentially, she saw, when she said, hey, I'm signing these papers, I trust y'all. Well, she did that with her mom. And essentially, she signed a bunch of papers giving her child up for adoption. She didn't even realize she signed those papers. And she never intended to give her daughter up for adoption. One of her children that her mother sort of tricked her into doing. And she writes all about how her mom tricked her into giving up her daughter because she just sort of trusted people and signed stuff.
And going along those lines, kind of, her, I think you paused there. Sorry. There you are. With this story, at the very end of it, she's giving this interview where she kind of lays out what happens in that pizzeria where she's lied to. But then years after, and very recently, and almost about when you guys were filming this, she then came out and said that, she'd been paid by the anti-abortion movement. So it seems like she had flipped kind of all over the place.
And to be quite honest, like her position on being pro-life or pro-choice is irrelevant. Is irrelevant to Roe in general. What's relevant is that they went out and essentially completely lied to this girl. She wanted abortion. They lied to her. They manipulated her, and they never spoke to her again. And that's really was the only importance. I mean, Roe is much bigger than Norma, and it's really not the Norma McCorvey story at all. So whether she is that's why she is pro-life or not pro-life, is really irrelevant to how Roe got passed and why he got passed.
Okay. Do you, so I mean, this might be too much of a political question for this film, but your major focus for this film is to highlight how the media, how certain activists and lawyers actively deceived the general public and while going through the court process. Do you think that if this had been a cleaner process without so much deception, that this would have turned out any other way? That some form of abortion law would not have
You know,
actually happened?
I don't, I have no idea. I think that some of the challenges that really not necessarily the media deception, and I think the media deception fueled the movement, which pressured the justices. So yeah, you may have not have had that much pressure, but I do think the statistics really, in the minds of the media, um, that sort of created all this pressure and this uprising and outcry of women. I mean, back then you guys weren't around, and neither was I. Really, I was born in 1975, so I didn't really grow up in the women's movement during the time. But anything you read or anybody you talk to who grew up in that time period, it was a massive movement. It was, you know, bigger than Black Lives Matter and went on for a lot longer. And it exerted extremes amounts of pressure on everybody. Families, the Vietnam War. I mean, it was sort of America was in the midst of a sort of a social and cultural revolution at the time, which I'm sure you've seen from history and movies and videos and documentaries. So anything that could fuel that pressure, I'm sure that was taken away, may not have changed the outcome. I have no idea. I think that coming up with complete fake statistics and completely making up stats that were untrue, I'm sure had a tremendous impact. But I think what more had an impact, which I think on the case, which or didn't have an impact, which I think would have an impact today, is technology. I mean, back then there was really a question of when is a child a human being, right? And when is there a baby that's there? And there wasn't a lot of technology, not a lot of, we didn't have the internet. There was sonogram technology, but it wasn't clear cut and dry. And nobody really, the thought process a lot back then was there really wasn't a baby until it kicked. And which is now we know is completely untrue. You can hear a heartbeat in the first couple of weeks. You can see babies sucking their thumb in the first trimester, and then we see there's an actual human being. That playing into the decision making between the justices saying when does a child or a baby or human being have actual constitutional rights, would have come more into play if that technology had been further along, which I think Roe was heard today. And I think also what the Supreme Court did, and the way they decided it, was completely unconstitutional, and not from a human being perspective, but it's not the court's job to create law. And what I mean by creating law is it's the justices that came up with a 3-trimester system. It's not their job as a Supreme Court justice to say, here's a new system. Their job is to see if there's a law and say that law's good or that law's no good. Not, hey, let's create a new set of laws to guidelines to be able to follow this law by. That's supposed to be the legislative branch of government. And if they wanted to do that, create a 3-trimester system, they should have gone to the legislative branch and done that. And so there's a lot of intricacies within in how that was decided and how it was created. And even people like Ruth Bader Ginsburg have come out and said that although she is happy with the outcome, it was the worst court case that was ever decided in history and how it was decided legally.
But I think with obviously you have Bernard Nathanson portrayed in this movie. You are the one who portrays him. You've got Sarah Weddington and I think it was Nicole Coffey, all the Supreme Court justices. Is there, what was it like just kind of diving into that and finding the way to portray each of these characters? And even if, you know, with this, like the Supreme Court, you know, there's a lot to go through. Just what kind of was like that whole process?
I mean, we really try to take each character at face value. I mean, we, you know, again, we read a lot. I read a lot. We spoke to a lot of people who knew these people personally. We read their not only books, but we read letters that they wrote to each other. We watched interviews. Read articles. And so portraying each person, I'm going to give you an example. I mean, Sarah Weddington, you know, we portrayed Sarah, you know, I mean, if you know, you watch Sarah Weddington, who is a lawyer for Norma Corby, you know, is an extremely, although young, brash, but extremely smart, competent, and driven woman. You know, in her first case, she gives this incredible speech where the crowd goes crazy and starts to cheer. And so, you know, we wanted to portray her exactly that. And we took a lot of the stuff from court transcripts. I mean, we literally took the court transcripts and used them verbatim in the court scenes. And so we really wanted to portray each character as we felt that they had been, whether they were smart, intelligent, not sophisticated, you know. And so we took a lot of that from, you know, again, what we read and who we interviewed and who we met.
Well, I guess with Sarah Weddington specifically, I think, and now it's been about a week since we watched the movie, and it was a rough cut of it. But I think there was a line where you point out that she hadn't been able to get a job for 6 months out of college. Well, I mean, if you're trying to portray her as this smart young lawyer, why include, you know, little tidbits?
Well, so I'll give you this. So her not being able to get a job out of college had nothing to do with her not being smart. So it had to do at the time that in Texas, firms were not going to hire female lawyers, period. And so the line had to do, she essentially had no money. She was completely broke, and the attack on that, or the description of that, had nothing to do with her intelligence, but to show she was out of work. She was desperately in the need of a job. She would have taken anything. And so she was easily persuadable. I mean, if you take somebody who's in desperate need of work and has no money and say, hey, we're going to give you a job, but you have to follow exactly what we do and say, at that time, as a woman, she said, okay. And she has zero experience. She had never even tried a case. And essentially, she was a pawn by Planned Parenthood and NARAL, essentially do exactly what they wanted, because they wanted a woman to be the lawyer.
On the same line as, you know, why include certain things, the one part of the movie that I think both of us just kind of sat and scratched our heads on was there's a Fortune and Abortion song. And there's, I don't know, maybe a half dozen different inclusions in this movie that are on the same line as this song that we're just kind of watching and don't quite understand the point of including in this movie. Is
Well, not even just like the inclusion of it, but how it's, because I think it's something that should be included, but just the way,
I don't know about that, but like
the way that it's included
is, first off, is the song factual? Like, did that actually happen?
Not only is it factual, we showed you the fact it was factual. I mean, you actually watch the movie, you can see during the epilogue, Bernard Nathanson wrote the actual dialogue of the actual song in one of his 3 books.
But I think what
we gave you the page number and everything.
By factual, and I think is it, you know, because I think what it says is,
did he sit around in his living room?
You guys are freezing again.
With his family members and sing the song as a part of
you guys. Sorry, you guys froze for a bit. So
yeah, I mean, as in factual, I mean, like, did this guy actually sit around in his living room and singing this song as, like, you know, a happy Sunday afternoon or something? Like,
but that's not how that scene was portrayed. They weren't singing a song like it was fun and happy. Larry was saying, hey, do you guys we got to, you know, come up with slogans and jingles. It's a movement. We got to come up with stuff. And Bernard didn't want to sing it and didn't want, you know, was embarrassed about it. And sort of got pushed into singing it.
But then I guess my question is, do you think that actually happened in real life, or do you think the way that they sang it was, I thought it was more like he had it sung in like med school.
And you guys keep on freezing. So
Okay, we're here. Sorry.
Repeat
What's-
the question.
Yeah, was it just something he like sang when he was out of school, or I thought it was more something that was sung in like med school?
correct. That's exactly what he said. You know, she says, "What's that song the residents sang when you were in med school, in your residency?" And he's like, "Oh, I don't really want to sing it. I really don't want to get into that." And Larry says, "No, no, no, come on, I want to hear it. Well, we need a jingle." Out of curiosity, he was just curious. It wasn't that they didn't sing around as doctors singing that song for fun, and that's not the way it was portrayed either. It was portrayed that he didn't want to sing it, and he was embarrassed about it. But it was something that the kids did when they were in college.
Well, yeah, and I think that's what it should have been focused on. But when you have, because I think there's a kid in the scene and the wife and the other wife, so I think just kind of that atmosphere of it felt different or off or not really how it should be portrayed in a movie that's supposed to be about the seriousness of abortion. I guess that's really just what we're trying to ask.
Well, I mean, you take it as a seriousness of abortion. Some people didn't, and some people didn't really think it was that serious. I mean, look today. Like a lot of people didn't think it was that serious back then. Because first of all, they didn't think it was a life. They just thought it was removing a clump of cells, and it wasn't that serious. But today, here's what's even crazier. Today, where we do know it's actually killing a human being, and we actually do know it's not removing a clump of cells. You have a lot of people still not taking it seriously. I mean, you've got people like Sarah Silverman out in Hollywood creating organizations called Shout Your Abortion, and people are part of an organization who get out there and says, "I can't wait for my 6th or 7th one. I'm going to have to celebrate." And these are celebratory things, and people are having fun with killing babies. And so, you talk about in a movie where things aren't serious by some people. Hey, sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. It's happening today in our society today, and we know much more about it.
But don't you think that what you portrayed should have been really serious? And I think the majority of what you did.
Well, we wanted to portray the truth, and we wanted to portray what people felt and what actually things that happened back then that nobody knew happened. And I think most people don't understand how abortion got. Everyone thinks, it was a woman's movement that created abortion. It had nothing to do with the women's movement at all. It became part of the women's movement through the pressure of Larry Lader and Bernard Nathanson, essentially.